Welcome to Africa Ascending, a podcast series looking at key issues affecting the African business environment, and more particularly its impact on the insurance sector in Africa. Hosted by Afro-Asian Insurance Services and Africa Ahead, in this series we'll be looking at everything from war to regulations, currency devaluation, and climate change. To access this podcast in other ways, we will be appearing on Africa Ahead, www.afapublishing.com, Spotify, and on the media page of Afro-Asian-insurance.com. My name is Liz Booth, and I'm Editorial Director at Africa Ahead. With me, I have
Uday Patel, Chairman and CEO of Afro-Asian Insurance Services Limited.
Today, we're talking about regulatory alignment and market expansion for the African insurance market within the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. To do this, we have Dr. Grace Muradzikwa, Commissioner at the Insurance and Pensions Commission in Zimbabwe. Grace joined the regulators after having served in the private sector for more than 20 years. And we have Agripah Marangwanda, CEO at Afro-Asian Reinsurance Brokers, Tanzania. Agripah has been with Afro-Asian since 2015, when he was Managing Director of the company's Southern African Markets operation. In that role, he was also Academic Board Chair of the Insurance Institute of Zimbabwe. He took on the CEO role of Afro-Asian Reinsurance Brokers Tanzania in 2021. Welcome to both of you. So today we're talking about regulatory alignment. So Grace, perhaps we could start with the where are we now question. We hear tell of regular opportunities for regulators to meet, discuss and plan. How closely are the regulators across the continent as we speak?
Okay, so good morning and thank you, Liz. Good morning, everyone. So I can't say we are close, but what I want to share with you is that regulators are talking, we are consulting each other, and right now we have lots of platforms that are available for regulators, for us to meet. I think let me start by saying that in country itself, we have lots of platforms as financial sector regulators. We meet on a regular basis, with the regulators for the banking industry, for capital markets. And then, we also have regional blocks, where there are various platforms for us to meet as regulators. I think starting for me in particular, we are members of SADC. So we also meet, as SADC regulators. I'm aware that Eastern Africa regulators, they're also meeting. West Africa, they are also meeting. But we've realized that there's a fragmented approach, as regulators because of all these blocks. And I don't know if you're aware, but we actually have started an organization for African supervisory authorities, which we are calling OISA. We now have a Secretary General and we are working on the structures. So this should improve collaboration across the continent. And hopefully it is also going to improve the level of alignment across the continent. In addition to that, just finally, Liz, as regulators, I think we've been alive to the need for us to engage with regulated entities. So we also attend platforms for regulated entities, so that we understand the challenges that regulated entities are currently navigating. And we have organizations like the African Insurance Organization, we have organizations like OSI, and some of these interactions also inform supervisory actions. So we are talking to each other. And it might not necessarily be visible to regulated entities, but I just want to assure you that lots of interaction and collaboration and sharing of experiences and also benchmarking. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you very much. Agripah, as a practitioner, Grace has just said it may not feel like that. What is your experience as a practitioner?
Okay, thank you, Liz, and thank you, everyone, and good morning. Yeah, your question, Liz, I would say it's a mouthful. I would try to split it into two. The first portion being to say that as a practitioner, what do I look at to check if the regulators are connected or not? I think number one, we look at the licensing requirements. Do we have standardized licensing requirements across the African continent? Obviously, the answer is no. Consumer protection and data privacy you would appreciate, Liz, that the coming in of COVID has seen a lot of digitalization in terms of the insurance products and services. And one of the concerns that are coming from us as practitioners is how consistent are the issues to do with consumer protection across the African continent. Then, of course, the issue of solvency and capital requirements across the African continent. If you look, for example, us as Afro-Asian, we have offices across the continent, covering the rest of the continent. One of the things that we ask ourselves is, do we have same licensing requirements? Do we have same oversight measures? Do we have the same risk management measures coming from the various regulators? I think Dr. Grace has spoken about the fragmentation of the African insurance market, but I would want to also say that there is some positives that are coming through. I would speak to those ones from a regional point of view. If you look at, for example, CIMA, which is the French-speaking countries, which combines about 14 countries within the CIMA region, they now have what we call the CIMA code, which establishes a regulatory framework that standardizes their operations. We also have the issues of supervision and capital from a CIMA perspective that has already been standardized. So from a CIMA perspective, I would say that yes, practitioners can actually experience that regulators are connected, but we still have challenges within those markets in terms of enforcement, because there's no really regulations that are there to enforce and push each other in terms of that. Now, coming back to other regions like SADC and East African Community, like what Dr. Grace has said, there are initiatives that I know that are being put in place, but I think filtering down to the customers themselves or the practitioners themselves, I think it's still a process, but we acknowledge that something is being done, but I think the filtering down is not yet being felt. And also maybe, Liz, just to put across to Dr. Grace, is also, whilst we are talking about integration, we are also seeing an element coming through where there's a bit of protectionism coming through, where markets are also, protecting themselves. You go to one country, whilst we are talking about integration, they are also talking about local content, protecting local players, protecting local insurers. So there's a bit of mixed reaction in terms of whether we are moving forward or we are not. So from a practitioner's point of view, I would say there's kind of a confusion. Yes, regulators are saying we are moving in this direction, but the practical implications, we're also seeing regulators talking about protectionism. So in a nutshell, I would say it's still a mixed bag. In other regions, we have moved. In other regions, we are still yet to move.
If I can just jump in here and address this to Dr. Grace, please. Dr. Grace, so I'm sitting in London. And if you look at the example of the European Union, they have a block where if I were an insurance company in France, say, I could write policies in Germany, in Portugal, in Spain, etc., in any country within the bloc. Now, obviously, that is a utopia for Africa. And as we've just heard from Agripah, in places like the CIMA zone, it is a reality where you have one license covering countries. But in your experience and being someone who's involved in all these platforms that exist, what is the horizon we are realistically looking at before this becomes a reality?
Okay, Liz, I think if I can come in, so I think we need to take a step back and understand the process that Africa is taking around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So right at the top, you've got the pronouncements which has been made by African leaders. So there's a commitment to integration. But you must also realize that Africa is a very big and diverse continent. You're looking at the social economic level of development. You're looking at the geopolitical issues. So there's a very structured approach, in my view, and I can see it. There's a structured approach that regulators are taking. I have shared the regional blocks that we're working with. You cannot talk about integration at the continental level without taking a stepped up approach. And what's currently happening is that you're looking at integration at SADC level, you're looking at integration at the East Africa Community level, you're looking at integration at the West Africa, you're looking at North Africa, and then you build up to the continental level. And I want to say that as we speak right now, specific to SADC, we have been working on the harmonization of model laws, and that has happened. At the recent SADC meeting, the African finance ministers actually adopted the SADC model laws, and we are now working on operationalizing it. So you've got a political commitment coming from our African leaders, but you then need to look at regulators to operationalize it. And there's a stepped up approach, starting with the different regional economic blocks, building up to the continental level. So I think this is the process that we're following. In my view, it's a structured approach, and it's happening. I can actually see it happening. And the first step for us as SADC is the harmonization of the model laws. That has already happened as we speak. So you ask a specific question about the timeframes. I can't share any timeframes right now, but I can tell you that I think for SADC, we're actually working. We're working, and this is something that is very much on our agenda. And I'm aware that for the East Africa regulators, it's also on the agenda. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is on the agenda. And now we are also working at the continental level is African supervisory authorities. So that's on our agenda. And I just wanted to respond to some of the issues actually that Agripah, referred to. Yeah, obviously, and I'm on record as saying that Africa is not a country, but sometimes I think I see regulated entities wanting to look at Africa as a country. You talk about harmonization of licensing requirements. Before we even talk about some of those issues, I think regulators are also concerned and keen to see sound and serious players on the African continent. And there are various issues that we're also looking at. There is alignment on the continent. And I think the fact that the regulators are talking about these issues, sharing experiences, we are also working on our own frameworks, I think, to make sure that they are aligned. And certainly there's a process that we are following. It's a structured process, and we are moving in that direction. So Liz, I think for now, that's what I would want to share. I'm seeing that alignment, and I'm actually seeing the traction, that regulators are taking.
Yes, Liz. I think I might want to come in and just speak to what Dr. Grace has said. I know in SADC, Dr. Grace, that there is a conversation about looking at the whole region as one block in terms of if you are sitting in Zambia, for example, and you want to place business in Zimbabwe, are you going to be considered as a foreigner or a local entity? I know there is discussion along those lines. And I can also confirm, like you rightly said, that even in East Africa, there is a conversation about standardizing the capital requirements across East Africa. I think we had a meeting with our regulators. The framework is in place. The exchanges are going through. And I agree that the process is moving. And I think one of the key issues that are coming out is that, like you rightly say, is that Africa is not one country. There are different countries. And I think that's where we really need to say, how do we navigate the national regulations to make sure that we can align them to the goal of integrating our countries in terms of regulation of our insurance entities.
One of the things that I was wondering about was what regulators see as the outcomes of consolidation. So, for example, are you mindful of the fact that there might be fewer insurers because the bigger kind of regional players might swallow up some of the smaller market entities? Are you worried about safeguarding the policyholder interests? Can you see a way that a cross-continent sort of regulatory police force, if you like, might operate? And then finally, also, how much do you worry about things like accumulation risk? If if more risk is retained in the continent as a consequence of this? So, where are your priorities as regulators in terms of outcomes?
Okay, so thank you, Liz. So I think when you talk about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, there are two aspects to it. I think on one hand, as a regulator, you are looking at preparing your own market for opening up. Because I think you acknowledge that, once you open up, you are opening to possibly much stronger players coming into your market. So part of the preparation is making sure that we are also stabilizing our own markets. Right. So you're looking at, yes, as Agripah has alluded to, you're looking at the levels of capitalization, for your own market, how strong are the entities that are in the market? So if there's any consolidation that is taking place, by the time you open your market, that consolidation is already taking place. And you actually have strong players in the market who are able to withstand competition, which is coming from, the foreign players. So, and I'm aware that all regulators are currently looking at this. We are looking at our solvency regimes. We're looking at our capitalization levels. In Zimbabwe, for instance, we're working with local currency-based capital structures, but we now have US dollar indexed capital structures. This is all in preparation for opening up. Because, when you are working with the local currency, which I think we're talking about currency issues and so on, you want a stable currency. You want to denominate your capital levels in a stable currency. You also want to look at your retention levels, making sure that definitely the entities that you have in your own market, can withstand competition. So we've been working, on this locally with our own regulated players. We've introduced our own solvency regime, which we're calling ZCAP, and which we're actually sharing experiences, with other markets as well in Africa. When you look at even the reporting requirements, as regulators, we are standardizing. We all know we are talking about IFRS, we are talking about ESG reporting, so even on the reporting standards, so that I think there are issues of comparability, because that's also going to be very key. If you can't compare across jurisdictions, then it becomes difficult for us to even assess soundness issues. So those issues, Liz, we are working on, we are preparing our own markets for opening up, so that by the time we open up, they are sound enough. You mentioned monitoring accumulation. So my view on this, Liz, is that insurers are in the business of managing risk anyway. So I think at the primary level, even as we structure our own reinsurance programs, you are monitoring your own retention levels and you are monitoring your accumulation. But if you are looking at in-continent or in-country accumulation, are regulators monitoring this? I would probably want to say that we are probably not actively monitoring accumulation, but we are somewhat monitoring accumulation, I think, through the reinsurance placements that are being made. You're also aware that most jurisdictions right now, they've got your right of first refusals. You want to make sure that you exhaust local capacity before you externalize. And you're also probably aware that there are a lot of discussions amongst regulators about making sure that you exhaust continental capacity before you go international. I think there are selfish reasons to this, and which we are all aligned with. For our complex risks, for the mega portfolios, we cannot internalize those in the country. We can't internalize on the continent. There is need for international support. What we do not appreciate is externalization of simple risks, right? The externalization. So the expectation, I think, from regulators, and also even as we work on the structures of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, is that these simple risks will be internalized within our jurisdictions, within the continent. But the complex and the more complex and mega risks will, of course, need the support of international markets. Yeah, so I think that's the point that I'd made. I do not think that is an unreasonable expectation, I think, from regulators.
The question I have is that in terms of exhausting local content and local capacity, which many jurisdictions follow, is that, Dr. Grace, is that more from preservation of hard currency, or do you think that is more for allowing local companies to grow and develop on domestic risks?
But Uday, I would say both. So I think let me start with the latter part of your question. So our expectation is that if our local players are also participating in our local risks, so there's market development, there's also even development of skills. You can imagine, for instance, I think Zimbabwe, we are well known with a big mining risk, but our own underwriters, we do not have expertise in underwriting of mining risks, for instance, because we are bringing in international players to come and underwrite our local risks at the exclusion of our own local players. So for me, I think it's twofold. There's the retention, yes, the retention of business in-house. You're also looking at preservation of much needed foreign currency. I think that has always been an issue, with our own central banks and ministries of finance, that we want to minimize unnecessary outflows, of foreign currency on risks that can be internalized in country. But I think the second aspect that you mentioned is also very, very critical. Market development, we've set up insurance entities so that they can provide a service to our local market. So what is the point of registering a local company and you are externalizing your risks? It really doesn't make sense. So, and then of course, I think for me in particular, it's really important that we also develop our skills in general.
Thank you very much for participating, Dr. Grace, and thank you for participating, Agrippa. And I want to thank all our listeners of our regular podcast, because please remember, at Africa Ascending, we ask the difficult questions in the hope of finding long-term solutions. Thank you, and join us again later.